We're all in the middle of a revolution. The world is changing. The forces of globalization and environmental issues and technological changes and demographics, part of it which is immigration, and part of it's about who we are and about how to pay for the kind of changes, are fundamentally changing the rules in every city in America. You've heard about New York, and I come from a city, Pittsburgh, that is in Pennsylvania, and it was the industrial center of America in World War II. 60% of the steel making in the United States was done in Pittsburgh. The iron, the glass were all made there. We were the center of manufacturing. That all disappeared. And what I learned growing up there and being the leader there as a mayor was the question for every city now is not to drift into the future, but to be intentional. So this last question really sets this conversation up very well, because I believe that cities that are not intentional about what they want to be will not succeed in the future, giving these kind of changes that are happening. And this is an example in the United States. These are a sampling of American cities. And in the last 25 years, if you look at this, virtually every city in America has lost anywhere from 25% to 50% of their manufacturing jobs. In 1990, there were often twice as many people working in manufacturing there were in professional services or with technical jobs in education and healthcare. And now that in 25 years, completely reversed. Look at, for example, Baltimore lost 56% of their manufacturing jobs in a 25-year period, but in the same period of time, they almost doubled the number of jobs they have in professional services and technical services. That speaks volumes about where cities are going and what they need to do, because what was the most important competitive advantage 25 years ago in many of these cities is no longer important. And what is the now most important competitive advantage in every city in the world is talent, is the ability of cities to train, to grow, and attract talent. So a sense of place, where people want to live because of the authenticity of the place, because of the richness of the culture, because of the recreational opportunities become more and more important. And to build every city so they all look the same is not creating a competitive advantage. And so the issue of what you build and how you build it, there needs to be a growing up in the room who has a strategic vision of what a city ought to look like. And so when the development community comes and says, I want to build this, it needs to be part of a bigger picture. Cities are not built by a series of transactions. Great cities are not built by a series of transactions. They're built by a remarkable vision of how it all fits together, whether it's transit or office buildings or residential or parks, how that all fits together. And that's part of what I want to talk about, because I'm going to give you some examples of American cities that have made choices. That's what this is about. Every city has to make a series of choices. And these are medium and smaller cities. I didn't want to deal with New York, but these are the hundreds of cities in Eastern Europe that are trying to find their place in a changing world. Denver would be an example. Denver made a decision to build a transit system, and it required the voters of Denver to tax themselves, to vote, to tax themselves, to build this transit system. As most of you know, the federal government in the United States has been dysfunctional for the last 15 or 20 years, and it is becoming more so. And so increasingly cities are cut loose, have to decide what their futures are going to be, and in large part, with some exceptions, have to figure out how they're going to finance what they want to become. Denver made a decision to build a 120-mile transit system. They raised the money themselves. They made the investments in that transit system. The vote was in 2004. If you go to Denver today, you'll see this remarkable development of a public-private partnership of the public sector building the transit, but partnering with the private sector to create major, very strategic transit-oriented developments. If you look at downtown Denver, where these transit lines come together, you will see an abandoned railroad yard. Literally, it was abandoned, about 30 acres that now has $2 billion worth of development on it. It is a remarkable example of public-private partnership, not only in the strategic vision of how to take advantage of that transit system, but also in the financing of how to deal with all the infrastructure and the environmental issues, and that a developer might not be able to carry the cost on this development. It is a remarkable example of how that happens. In Oklahoma City, one of the most conservative places in America, the citizens of Oklahoma City 12 years ago made a decision to tax themselves, to build a city that many couldn't even conceive of, a city that it was not a very livable city. People went to work and left. And now, if you look at Oklahoma City, it has made huge investments in open space and parks and the amenities that created a great sense of place. Chicago is another great example. If you've been to Chicago, you might have seen Millennium Park. Millennium Park, you know, that was an abandoned railroad yard, and Mayor Daley, then the mayor of Chicago, proposed to buy it and to put a two-car parking garage and just simply to cap it with grass. Instead, the citizens, the civic leaders of Chicago said, if we're gonna build and add to Grand Park, one of the great parks in the United States, we ought to do something really world-class. And rather than just creating a grass field and a parking garage, let's build what we now know as Millennium Park. And what has happened is it has created $2.5 billion worth of investment around it in condominiums, and it has now become the most visited place in Chicago because that city made a choice, as Denver did, to become something other than what they were. And so the issue is, what is the competitive advantage of Warsaw or Prague, and how do you not lose that in your rush to develop? How do you keep that authenticity that makes Warsaw such a special place? And how do you build on that, not overwhelm it? And that's really the challenge of a strategic vision and choices that citizens are making about their cities. And let me talk about Pittsburgh. How many of you have ever heard of Pittsburgh? And how many of you have ever been there? How many of you are Pittsburgh Steelers fans? That's our football team, okay. So you know, and if you've been there recently, you might know our history. As I mentioned, we were the industrial center of America. And my father worked in a steel mill for 51 years, and 60% of the people that worked in Pittsburgh worked in heavy manufacturing. And between 1970 and 1990, that disappeared. Literally disappeared, and this is our population fell from 2,700,000 people. As you can see, we lost almost 400,000 people, left Pittsburgh, left the whole region. Imagine Warsaw losing 400,000 people that have now moved to Prague or to Paris or somewhere else. They left because they couldn't see a future for themselves. And we became the second oldest city in America. Only Miami, Florida is the oldest because people retire there. People weren't retiring to Pittsburgh. It was because our young people were all leaving, because they couldn't see a future for themselves. And so we faced a very difficult challenge. We were in 1983. In 1983, we had a 22% unemployment rate. We were the most economically depressed place in America, and we were one of the most environmentally degraded places in America. When I was growing up, my mother would always say to me, you know, when we were going out to play, she would always say two things: be home before the streetlights come on, and she would say, never go near those rivers. If you go in the rivers, you're going to melt, because they were so polluted. And now, as you might know, The Economist magazine 30 years later has now ranked Pittsburgh the last couple years the most livable city in America. How do we move from a city that was as bad as shape as it was to one that is viewed as a very successful city? We did because we built a series of partnerships. We worked with the private sector and we partnered with the private sector. When I became mayor, we made a decision that we were going to not manage decline, which the city had been doing, and we were going to think about what it means to manage growth again. And we felt that we needed to have money. We had no money. Imagine losing half of your population in the city. Almost 300,000 people left Pittsburgh. So we wanted money, land control, and sophisticated deal-making capacity. And we reduced our day-to-day expenditures in the city and shifted money to invest in the future. We went ahead, the first year I was mayor, we just bought the old steel mills. We as a city bought over 1,500 acres of steel mills because the private market was never going to get involved we were such a weak market. And then we went into the marketplace and said, who's going to share our dream with us? Who's going to become a partner with us in building the kind of city that we could only imagine? How does that happen? And so this would be an example. This is a steel mill where my father worked for 51 years, and when I became mayor, I directed our redevelopment agency to buy it. And so where 10,000 men and women made steel, there's now a cheesecake factory. My father would shoot me if he were alive. But it was a public-private partnership. You can see there's actually almost $700 million worth of development on that 140-acre steel mill site. And there's mixed-use development of residential and retail and office buildings, many office buildings that are housing a new series of development. But it was strategically planned. We partnered with developers. They weren't our adversaries. They were our partners. We looked at this site and we worked with developers, and the developer would come and say, I'm willing to do residential development, but I don't know if I can get the rent. I need to rent at this level to be able to, or I can't afford to deal with the environmental risk. And so we said, we'll take a risk with you. We'll invest with you. This is the local government. We will invest with you to get this property to a place where you think you can make money. And if you make more money than you believed you could, then we'll share the profit with you. If you don't get to that, then that's okay. We will create value in other ways from it. So we were looking at ways to first create and then to capture value. The other was Pittsburgh had two very good universities, Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh. And we saw those as the manufacturing was declining, we saw those as the economic engines of the region. And Carnegie Mellon University not only as a place where it's growing and it's being hired, but is also at the cutting edge of technology. We did not have an entrepreneurial climate. We were a city of big unions and big corporations. And so we had to build a whole new infrastructure. That meant we need to build an entrepreneurial culture, which we didn't have. What does that mean? It means that the availability of venture capital. It means how easy is it for a professor or a young student who comes up with an idea to go into the marketplace to commercialize that? How does that happen? What's the process that has a community that supports that effort? And so we began to build that infrastructure. And so now there are hundreds of small startup companies in Pittsburgh, but there are also other companies, bigger companies, that saw an opportunity to come to Pittsburgh. We, the city, financed on the university campus this building, which we call the Pittsburgh Innovation Center. And it's a building not for new startups, but for existing companies like Microsoft and Google and Disney that are doing research at Carnegie Mellon University, that they would place to hang their hat and be able to work in a nice environment. Google located here 8 years ago with 2 employees. Google now has 800 employees in Pittsburgh. They grew out of that building. They took over an old abandoned warehouse. Don't tear down your old warehouses. They create real value. This was an old abandoned bakery, 8 stories high. Google worked with a private developer. We helped provide some of the financing. They now have 800 jobs there, and they're going to change your lives, Chris, because they're developing the software for the driverless car. And so we have driverless cars riding around on our streets in Pittsburgh all the time now. By the way, it's pretty disconcerting to see a car going down the street with nobody in it, okay? And so we are watching a fundamental transformation, but key to this, 70% of Google's workforce either rides a bike or walks to work. They want to be in a low urban environment, and one of the earlier speakers said, there's a convergence of those of us with gray hair and our kids or even our grandkids, because we all want the same kind of lifestyle now. We want walkable, livable places that have lots of excitement and vibrancy. And cities need to think about how they create that, how all that happens. And so this is Pittsburgh, it's shaped by 3 big rivers about the size of the river here. And we were losing that downtown, and we made a decision that we needed to make investments in that downtown as a place that was vibrant. It was a place only where people would go to work. There was nobody that lived in the central city. And so we invested heavily in culture. There's the ballet and the opera, we all clustered together, and they have 1,500 performances a year, and millions of people come to that culture and the arts. It's a huge driver to create that sense of place and excitement. Let me just show you it really quickly. This was the cultural district, that little block right there. And so the culture, and that was our rivers. That's what they look like. That's why my mother told me not to go in them. And that's what our rivers look like today, because we focused on cleaning them up. Have you had the big rubber duck here yet? That's from Germany, actually. It created a big sensation for us. And so that's what the North Shore looked like. How many architects and planners in the room? So what were you all smoking and drinking in the 60s and 70s? Because if you look at this, you can see we built this big stadium, and what was the highest and best use around that stadium directly across the river from downtown? It was surface parking lots in a road. And so that's what's there today. We tore that down. We moved the road off the river. We created a great park. There's hundreds of millions of dollars of investment now, as you can see, where those parking lots, that's what we did. We blew it up. Our team lost the championship, and so we blew up, and we built all this instead. By the way, that baseball park is now ranked as the best baseball park in America, other than the 2 old ones. That's the football stadium we built, and that's the baseball park. And we built a new convention center. When we built it, it was the largest certified green building in America when it opened about 10 years ago. And we built great public spaces. Where that parking lot was and where that road was on the river, we took the road out, and we built waterfalls like this, places where people just love to come together. An earlier speaker, I think Carl, said people, and somebody else, like Chris, you were talking about, people just want to come together in an environment that's a wonderful place to come together. And we took our riverfronts, which were all industrial and railroads, and now you can have miles and miles of bike trails along those rivers. One other development, this was a slag dump. Does this all sound familiar? You have a big slag dump like this here in Warsaw. And this was 250 acres. And slag had been dumped there for 90 years. This is 250 feet deep. And we bought that. And everybody, we being the city, we bought it, and everybody thought we were crazy. And we partnered with private developers who shared our dream, and we partnered financially and in terms of designing what it ought to be. That's what the slag was being dumped there. And now we have 700 homes. Of 250 acres, we put 150 acres into a new park. This development is the most successful housing development in the Pittsburgh region. Houses are selling upwards of $1 million, which in New York is nothing, but in Pittsburgh is a big deal. And And there was a stream that ran through there. It was badly polluted with old sewer lines and runoff from the slag. And we invested in that stream, and we built a series of wetlands to clean it up so the water is naturally filtered. And now there are fish and ducks and life that comes there, and we put a park through there. It is remarkable what really smart young engineers can do in terms of recapturing the environment. This was an old railroad bridge. This was called the hot metal bridge, and 40% of the steel-making capacity of the United States in World War II went across that bridge every day. It was heavily guarded by the military for fear of sabotage. My father worked in the mill during the war, and that's where he had his lunch every day. And I directed our development agency to buy that, and we converted it to a trail, a bike trail. It is one of the really historic bridges, and it has added immensely to the city. We wove the city together with a whole series of public parks. And so the challenge of every city, Pittsburgh was no different, though it was so down and out, is that we're a jigsaw puzzle. All these pieces, every city has wonderful parts to it. And the challenge is, how do they get put together in an exciting, wonderful, motivating picture? And putting that together is the challenge of a city, to lay out that strategic development. So part of it is thinking strategically, not transactionally. How does this all fit together? I believe for developers, and many developers told me this, so if you had come to Pittsburgh when I was mayor, and you would say, Mr. Mayor, I have a great idea for you in your city, I would say, with all due respect, you tell me why it's a good idea for you. We'll decide whether it's a great idea for us. And if our self-interests converge, we'll figure out how to make it happen. That assumed we knew what we wanted. If cities get developed by transaction, meaning that they don't have that sense and they take whatever is given to them, it's like a symphony with no conductor. You end up with really detached kind of development. Take this is New York City. And I think this is one of the most exciting developments in America. This was an old railroad trestle, 30 feet high, that ran down the west side of Manhattan for about 25 blocks. It had been abandoned in the 1960s, and it was sitting there as this big eyesore. And the city had a meeting and proposed to tear it down. And all these young people came, not really architects, came and said, you don't want to tear that down. We hang up there. We got to climb up there, and it's an incredible view of the city. This is the craziest idea you've ever heard, right? But the mayor then, Mayor Bloomberg, said, let's take a look at this. The High Line, if you go to New York, I put it #1 on my list to go see. If you go there, you'll see billions of dollars worth of development all along it now. It is an incredible park on an old railroad trestle, 30 feet in the air. At the end of it, at the north end of it, the largest development in America is now happening over these railroad yards. And I heard the man speak involved with that development. And he said, you know, our development is right at the end of the High Line. So think about this. This old railroad trestle is now defining the location of the largest development in America. That's the value of place, of creating really special places in a city. And that doesn't happen by accident. It happens intentionally. And the other is leadership. You know, none of this is easy. Nobody wants to change. And yet the whole world is changing. We're in the middle of a revolution. And so who's going to be the leader that says, this isn't going to work anymore? When I proposed as mayor, when I was running for mayor, that we were going to buy the steel mills and redevelopment, the unions picketed me. Because they wanted to bring the steel mills back. The steel mills were never going to come back. But they weren't going to change. And so it is not about today. It is about what Warsaw or Prague or all the other smaller cities in Poland and in Eastern Europe need to be thinking about what they ought to look like. It's about how to build partnerships. This doesn't happen without the development community. And that's why I think for cities to be clear on what they want to be, and the developers who then understand they can be a part of that, and how you make that partnership happen is really the challenge that you all have. If you don't have good leadership in a city, frankly, I wouldn't want to invest in it. because I don't think it knows where it's going. I want a city that knows what it wants to look like and what your role can be in that, not as an adversary, but as a partner in making that picture happen. And finally, we talked about talent. This is just a few of the companies in the last 2 years that have moved out of the suburbs into downtowns. Marriott has moved from a suburban area in Washington, D.C. to downtown Washington. General Electric moved their corporate headquarters and some of their research from a very fancy Connecticut suburban community into downtown Boston. Kraft Foods and Motorola have moved millions of square feet of office space from these suburban areas into downtown. Why are they doing that? They're doing it because they're chasing talent. Listen to me on this. For the first time in history, people aren't going to where jobs are. Jobs are beginning to go where people are. Those fancy suburban communities in Chicago and Connecticut didn't have mass transit, didn't have any there. Might, in some cases, didn't even have rental housing. And when their mayors proposed that they ought to build rental housing or create a downtown, some of them lost elections and got thrown out because people didn't want to change. But if they don't change, they're not going to be successful because jobs are following talent for the first time in history. And the other is, for those architects and planners, this is all about great design. When I drive into a city and the sign on the city can say, "Welcome to Warsaw." We're a world-class city, we're a green city, we're a great city. You can say a lot of things. You would never put on that sign, "Welcome to Warsaw, we're a mediocre city," would you? But by what you build will say that loud and clear. If you build disconnected or ugly buildings, given the architecture that has been created here, if you don't build off of that and think about what you're building, you say that loud and clear without ever saying it. And that is what will drive choices people make about where they want to live. And this is an example in Pittsburgh. This was right at the entrance to our major university. What did we think the best use of that property was? A surface parking lot. Shame on us. So we took it out and we put a big park in, and 600 people were really mad at me because they said, "Where are we going to park?" You'll figure it out. But it's more important to have a great public space. A friend of mine, a former mayor of Charleston for many years, would say that the most important places in a city ought to be in the public realm. If this is the introduction to the university, then it ought not to be a surface parking lot. It ought to be a great space. Not only did we build a park, we put a carousel there. There's a great restaurant. It's packed when people are there. So that's the choice. The cities everywhere are facing a series of choices. They want to be great cities. Every city says they want to be a great city, but it doesn't happen by saying it. It happens because people are intentional. It happens because there's leadership, and there's a vision, and there are choices that are made in the context of that vision. That's the challenge, and at the end of the day, I think it will happen. It's not about whether there's enough money or whether there's interest. It is always about whether there's the political and community will to want to reach, to not just be satisfied with where you are, but to want to reach, to really become one of the best place that you can become. Building on who you are. That's the challenge. Thank you.